Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this lunch discussion on the Western Indian Ocean, despite what's written in the program. My name is Dhruva Jaishankar. I'm director of the US initiative at the Observer Research Foundation. And it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel on developments in the Indian Ocean region, and particularly two parts of the Indian Ocean region, which we'll get into. And we have a really distinguished panel here today to discuss these issues. I'll just briefly introduce them. And what I thought we would do, since this is over lunch, I have a few questions that I'll ask to each of the panelists. But very soon, I hope we can open it up to questions and hopefully spend the second half of the next hour and a half fielding questions from all of you and making this more of a discussion. Our panel today consists of people from a variety of backgrounds: security officials, from politics, economics, and diplomacy. These include, to my immediate right, Ebtisam Al-Khatbi, who is the president and founder of the Emirates Policy Center in the United Arab Emirates. Ambassador Navdeep Suri, now with the Observer Research Foundation, but previously has just concluded a long and distinguished diplomatic career in the Indian Foreign Service, was amongst other places India's envoy to Egypt, the UAE, and Australia. Kwame Oino, who is the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs in Nairobi, Kenya, and is an economist, an economic researcher by background. General Dominique Rakotafi, who's the former Minister of Defense of Madagascar. And last but certainly not least, Minister Ahmed Al-Sayed, who is the Minister of State from Qatar. So we have people again from the Gulf region, from the eastern seaboard of Africa, and we'll be discussing how some of these developments are actually quite significant, not just for those sub-regions, but for the broader region, and certainly from an Indian perspective as well. Let me start by asking Ebtisam Al-Khatbi. In some ways, the Gulf region has been in the news a lot in the last few days and weeks, and for a variety of reasons. It's a place where many countries have a lot of interest for a number of reasons. About 40% of 40% of world's oil, about 64% of internationally traded oil, goes through some of the choke points in the Gulf region. Could you just explain in some ways, from your perspective, what are some of the main security challenges and some broader challenges in the region from your perspective?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I know it's hard to eat and listen. I'll try my best. I think establishing a collective security system in the area, in Gulf mainly, which and the Arabian Sea, which include also Iraq, Iran, GCC, Iraq, and Iran, and Yemen. This has been a call for years, but today, this call and the recent escalation between the US and Iran risks to the security of commercial tankers, energy security, security of waterways, and the impact of all of this on the global economy, and requirements of sustainable security environment between the Gulf on one side and Asia and Indian Ocean and Europe and West on the other side now. Because the main theme in our talk is the development. This region, it's a problem that it's never been stable. It's going from war to another, So building a sustainable solution for crisis in that region is based, from my view, on four themes. First, enhancing the implementation of the international law and UN Charter. I think Lavrov mentioned yesterday this problem. The other thing also, enabling the regional organization to play a bigger role in dealing with regional tensions and achieving security and stability. The third is enhancing political action and making it more effective in de-escalating tension and solving crisis to fulfill a legitimate aspiration of people. The fourth is focusing on development and investment for the renaissance of the people. And of course, there are some obstacles. Mainly, I will mention two that prevent the emergence of that collective security in the Gulf region and in the Arabian Sea, which is first the absence of a sustainable deterrence system that can help and create a balance and discipline security environment in the region where instigators of wars and military confrontation become less active. This is responsibility of the major global powers, mainly China and US, that have a final say in the Gulf region. Here, the problem of sub-regions, that when you have the escalation between major powers, comes down on the sub-regional system. If you de-escalate the tension between the global power, will go down on the second and the last. And here I would say that in the Middle East, we lack that model, which is for development model, which can be generalizable to other countries, that can teach them lessons where fruit and prosperity and gains stability can attract this nation instead of choosing path towards and conflict. We, at the end, we lack that kind of formula that make everybody in the region feeling that they are win-win instead of zero-sum game, which is happening now in this region. Thank you.
Minister, from a perspective of Qatar, what do you see as some of the opportunities that are there, and what do you see as the path forward for? We heard about development being a major concern. Where do you see the drivers or mechanisms for that development coming from?
Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to participate here. I think the whole, we are part as a Gulf or GCC, part of the Indian Ocean, also a route in which we have East Africa, and we have most of the trade also of this region heading to Asia, and a huge development potential with Africa. So stability is the most important factors here, which, as everyone knows, we went through a different phase of development in this region. A lot of wealth being invested, a lot of education, a lot of infrastructure, which is physical infrastructure and social infrastructure, and that gives huge potential for these community, and the region and nations to develop it, to take it to the next level. But without security and the stability, you will not have development and prosperity. I think we still lack of mechanism to implement our shared vision. I understand, a lot of our countries share the same vision, the same ambitious, but it comes to the implementation stage where how you can translate this vision to a clear plan and execute it at the same time, which I think it's a clear mechanism and cooperative mechanism, will lead to more enhancement and more development in our region, which I think it's very important at the strategic geographical location in terms of global trade or commerce here. In terms of infrastructure investment, I think a lot of investment being done in port, free zones, and sea lines and all these things, but still there is a revolution in terms of technology happening, this decade and the next decade, which we should think, smartly, how we can utilize it and to implement it so the normal people can feel the difference, and we can, enhance and, contribute to the ease of doing business between all of these countries. Because at the end, business, more business will lead more prosperity and more development, in addition to the other things, I'm sure, education and social stability is a key factor to this.
You mentioned the GCC. The last few years we've seen some rifts within the GCC. How do you think that sort of addressing that will be necessary going forward? I mean, from a political point of view?
Stability, it's very important, even within GCC. That's a key factor. And GCC as a collective council, it's important also when you negotiate different trade deals and different bilaterals and multinational treaties between Europe, America, Asian country. So the more stability and the more rule of law and let the mechanism to work to sort out any dispute or differences in terms of opinion, it's highly recommended here.
And before I turn to some of the other participants, I was intrigued by what you said about the responsibility for ensuring stability relies to some degree with the major powers. Do you think that the countries of the Gulf, countries of the Middle East, could be doing more to ensure that there is stability in the region, given the volatility that we've seen over the last few years? Or will it really rely on, as you mentioned, the US, China, perhaps Russia and others to play a role in bringing that about?
I do. GCC, because they don't have any hegemonical aspiration. On the other part, they don't have this. This is the problem also for imbalance between the two sides of the Gulf state, which is other state that used proxies. So GCC, if you look at them, they are not a destabilized factor. The other side, who is playing the destabilized factor in our region. So I do believe, and look at their countries and compare it with the other countries, okay? Look to us all in GCC, the infrastructure, the development can present a model for the region.
Turning a little bit to the south, Kwame, if I could bring you into the conversation and sort of geographically at least widen the conversation. A lot more attention is being paid also to the eastern seaboard of Africa, partly due to the high growth rates of several countries in the region, Kenya, Tanzania, amongst other places, partly for the geography, partly for the fact that there's a lot of foreign investment. China, Japan, India, in fact, has a lot of credit to the countries of East Africa and South Africa. So, what do you see as some of the main challenges and opportunities from a perspective of a country on the eastern seaboard?
Okay. I think I'd collapse them to about 4. And to my mind, it's clear. If you think about the African continent as a whole and compare the size of the sea, across the seaboard, one of the first things you realize is that you have, it's much, Africa is the second largest continent in geographical terms, but the sea on its east, it's bigger than the continent itself. And these countries tend to have very small navies, generally. I think the most formidable navy on that continent is the South African one, which is much further south. Kenya and the others have pretty small navies, which might compound, or rather, which might be a challenge for security problems. I think the last one was about 3 years ago when we had off the coast of Somalia, partly because of the difficulties that government has had. So security in general, I think, as a global good, is a good that even East African seaboard countries in general would enjoy. The second is, I think, has to be something that goes beyond every country's economic space with regard to, of course, the exclusive economic zone. But again, I would say Africa is peculiar, and I'm speaking about Africa generally, not necessarily that their interests are the same, but Africa is peculiar because it's one of the few continents in which you have the highest number of countries that are landlocked, and therefore are very dependent on trade, on the major ports that are actually created. So the East African countries in general have been creating massive ports, partly for good or bad with investment from the Chinese. So if you talk about Djibouti, one of the largest ports, you come down towards the south. Kenya is constructing a huge port as well in Lamu, a natural harbor. There's a port in Mombasa, and Tanzania is constructing a huge port as well, $10 billion for a country whose GDP is 100 billion. I mean, so 10% of GDP investment in one port is significant wherever you speak about it. So on the whole, you see that everybody's trying to marshal that. My view first is I think we need to be cautious because in my thinking, or rather our analysis at the Institute of Economic Affairs tells us that there's going to be too much capacity in terms of port infrastructure in that part. But if you leave that aside and go towards what else comes with ports, I think services, and I think liberalization of services globally, and through whatever trade arrangements countries could make on that seaboard, I mean, the area we're speaking about will be significant because port services don't just come with the infrastructure in the physical sense. I think you need technology and everything else. So global cooperation, I think, is the third point that is required, whether it's investment towards the ports, but also allowing for movement of people, movement of capital, obviously, is much easier right now than it is movement of people, but I think those are things to consider. Trade, I don't think we need to talk about that. A critical one, however, is that if you live in Kenya, or East Africa in general, I looked at the map just before I came here, and I told you about how big that space is, but one of the things that I discovered is that East Africa was the last. East Africa was the last of all parts of the world that were connected by a submarine cable. Up until about 11 years ago, most of the connections for internet connection in Kenya actually came from satellites. And you understand how expensive that is and obviously the questions. So right now there are 5 cables connecting to the East African board. Many of them connect through the UAE. But one thing that you notice in Kenya, which is home to 5 of them as well, most of them actually pass through Kenya, but one of the things that you find about it is, and I'll mention that Somalia, for instance, whose development concerns should also concern us, has only 1. But one of the things is capacity is low, but the worst part is once in a while when you have a ship somewhere around the Persian Gulf passing and disconnecting one of those cables, then you suddenly notice it in the whole of East Africa. So questions of investments around this, but also the question about cable systems are actually expanding the number, both in terms of capacity, but in the number alone would be a useful one. So as I come to the final 4th point, is just basically research and innovation around those areas. As I said, the sea is huge. Many African countries have. Kenya, for instance, has a marine science capacity. I looked at it, and there's cooperation with some countries from Europe, none from India. Perhaps we can speak about that later. But that, I think, is also huge possibility for scientific research around those areas. So in my view, those 4 areas are the imperatives for now. Thank you.
You mentioned that, with all of this port infrastructure being built up in East Africa, down the coast, down the Western Indian Ocean, that there'll be perhaps overcapacity. And one of the concerns that has been articulated, and we heard this on some previous panels over the last day and a half, has been the potential securitization of use of some of these ports for security purposes. How concerned do you think you would be about the potential of some of these ports to end up being developed for military purposes, and that aggravating at least some of the security challenges that you laid out?
Well, I don't know that I don't know that that would by itself be a problem. As I told you, that most African countries on the seaboard have very small armies. So Kenya, for instance, has a navy of less than 8,000 personnel. So obviously, the capacity of these navies, and I hate to emphasize military development, but the capacity of these navies is required because, for instance, 5 years ago, as you remember, the East African seaboard had serious problems with pirates. Some of them based in Somalia because of its own unique security problems and, of course, government and all that. So yes, I think that might happen. If, however, it'll mean that we will have foreigners or foreign governments actually deploying forces in that place, specifically on land, that might raise unique political problems. I know in Kenya, for instance, perhaps in further south in Tanzania as well. I'm not too sure about the other areas. South Africa has a formidable army, so maybe that would be. But yes, possibilities of actually cooperation around that area in terms of ensuring security is an important one. What I need to mention, however, is that the peace, or rather the security in the seaboard was actually restored to a large extent by a combination of French, British, even Chinese armies coming to that place and helping to stabilize because it's a huge area for global trade. And most of Africa's trade, or I would say Kenya's trade, tends to be with Asia. Of course, across the sea, it's still very small, but I think the opportunities for its growth are massive.
In general, when we think about the major choke points in the Indian Ocean, or potential choke points, people talk about the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Aden, but the Madagascar Strait is in fact another one that people have been paying increasing attention to. As a former defense minister, what are some of the security solutions being sought for some of the challenges that we spoke about, whether it's non-state actors such as pirates or the risk of more state-driven security competition?
Thank you. To start with, let me first thank the organizer for inviting me as the first representative of Madagascar to come to this dialogue. I feel honored for that. And even if I'm generally here, I apologize for not wearing my uniform, not to avoid ambiguity, because I speak for myself here, and since I will be retiring in a couple of months. Talking about security, let me give you just a short background of Madagascar to give you an overview of what's happening there. You know that Madagascar is just off the coast of South Africa, and it's at the crossroads of three major shipping routes from the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa to the Gulf. The second one is from the Cape of Good Hope to the Strait of Malacca. And the third one is from the Cape of Good Hope to Australia. So with this flow of ships in thousands each year, there is really a security concern. What do we face there? We are facing some threats and incidents, but incidents because of number of the ships passing through, shipwrecks. From shipwrecks we have marine pollution, especially those huge tankers who pass by in the south. And also there is a large illegal trafficking, inflow and outflow. For the outflow, there are tapping of natural resources like timber, rosewood, for example, mines, precious stones. And for the inflow, there is illegal trafficking of drugs. Madagascar becoming more and more a transit route for drugs to from Africa to the Indian Ocean area, especially to Mauritius. And and also trafficking of, I would say, false medicine, fake medicine, which are not good for the people. And then we have maritime piracy, as my colleague here mentioned earlier. And this is one of the major challenges we face since the beginning of this millennium in the early 2000s, with the piracy of the coast of Somalia growing and getting back to the south up to Madagascar. There was a concept of setting up information fusion center, which is a regional maritime fusion center, which is set up in Madagascar 5 years ago. It's just like that of one in Singapore, regional one, and taking care of all the area in the Indian Ocean from the Gulf of Aden to India and to the south to the Cape of Good Hope. And this center is meant to build up some maritime domain awareness of what's happening at sea. And this is a program with the European Union called Maritime Security, MASE. And it's coupled with one center for regional center for operational cooperation in Seychelles to fight piracy off the coast of Somalia. And it works then closely with the Atalanta operation system in the north. So this is, I think, an opportunity for the region to connect with other centers, to have a coherent, common awareness of the problems in the Great Indian Ocean by connecting and exchanging information to be able to make up good decisions in what will be done afterwards.
General, you mentioned the Information Fusion Center in Madagascar. We're 15 years removed from what is perhaps one of the worst natural disasters, at least of the last 20 years, which was the 2004 tsunami, Indian Ocean tsunami. And one of the conclusions drawn soon after that was how the Indian Ocean, compared to other oceans, was relatively undergoverned. It did not have strong institutions and mechanisms for humanitarian assistance and other things. Since then, we've seen the development not just of the Information Fusion Center in Singapore, but also Madagascar and now in India as well. Could you speak a little bit about some of the efforts to perhaps cooperate with a country like India on maritime domain awareness? Is the government of Madagascar taking a role in that?
Yeah, I think there should be an opportunity to cooperate with other countries like India. In fact, for Madagascar, the damage caused by cyclones every year takes up to 5 to 6% of the GDP. And it's very hard for a small and poor country like ours to tackle that and to be resilient afterwards, because it destroys seaports, airports, cities, all of the roads and bridges. Mm-hmm. So I think we need experiences from other countries in the region, especially in the early warning system, because most of the cyclones come from this area or East Asia, and it goes down southwest. So I think that setting up an early warning system and coordinating with other countries will be very helpful in that case.
Ambassador Navdeep, we've heard now from people from the Gulf and from East Africa. You've served, of course, in UAE, in Egypt, in Tanzania, and amongst other places. From an Indian perspective, why, what are the major issues? Why is there interest in this region, and what is India doing in terms of building up its capability in the region?
Well, like all the speakers have said, everybody has interest in the region, and I think ours, from an Indian perspective, I'll just mention 3 or 4 key areas. A very large part of our energy security rests in the Gulf. A chunk of our oil and gas supplies come through the Strait of Hormuz. In the Gulf, we have close to 10 million Indians residing, 3.4 million in UAE, 1 million in South Africa, significant populations in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Seychelles, in Mauritius. Our trade with the Gulf is $100 billion almost. And so it's vital for us to make sure that those sea lanes remain open. I think what has changed over the last few years is that from a relatively passive position, we've started taking a much more active interest in the security in that area. I think it's happening on 2 levels. One is with UAE, for example, we did our first joint naval exercises to drive home the point that we have shared maritime security interests in the region. In Oman, as you know, in Duqm, we now have facilities. In other countries, whether it's Seychelles or Mauritius or Maldives, we are actively working to build capacity, sometimes by giving Coast Guard vessels, sometimes by giving ships, sometimes by carrying out hydrographic surveys. We are actively chasing white shipping agreements with many of the countries in the region, sometimes even providing the expertise for that so that we build a better maritime domain awareness picture. And the center in Gurgaon, as you know, is active now. So we've started taking an active interest in the architecture, but nevertheless, and I think because Dr. Kitby is here, I'll take the liberty of bringing in that there is a challenge in terms of the aggressive posture being taken by some countries, which is your point that is it only mercantilistic or is there also a military aspect to that? And we saw the manner in which DP World, which is the world's 3rd largest operator of ports based in Dubai, was unceremoniously ejected out of Djibouti simply on the power of money. And I know that DP World has taken it very seriously and they are suing the Chinese company in London and now in Hong Kong. But they've won it at both places, but the issue has come, how do you enforce the violation of the contract and the victory in the court or the arbitration agreement? So I think it really does pose a challenge when one player is muscling in quite aggressively into a neighborhood and taking it beyond trade and commerce into those militaristic domains. We saw a bit of that happening in Maldives as well. And again, these are matters of concern to us, and this is why I think the need for our countries to work collaboratively in the region is going to be to the benefit of all of us.
No, we've heard about some of the broad challenges here, but I want to just ask before turning it over to the audience, ask the panelists about 2 that did not get much attention. Interstate competition obviously is one, non-state actors, piracy and others. How much is climate change, maybe starting with Ambassador, how much is climate change or a factor in that sort of it requires greater cooperation in this part of the world, and what are the costs of not cooperating or not working on that issue?
Well, if you remember the very dramatic images from Maldives a few years back when there was an underwater metering done by the Prime Minister, I think that drove home the recognition of the very existential threat to some countries in that. In other countries, we are seeing erosion of coastal areas at a pace which is unprecedented. And I think as we speak about cooperation in the Indian Ocean area, and I think UAE is going to be the chair of the IORA conference from this November, perhaps, or already is, yeah. So I think this is one of the issues that is coming up, that given the realities of climate change, how we work together in mitigating some of the impacts? How can we maybe work towards building more climate resilient infrastructure in coastal areas that is better able to withstand the ravages that we are seeing?
And actually, the IORA is a nice segue to my second question, and perhaps any of you can answer this. Beyond, we spoke a little bit about the GCC, but what are other institutions, I mean, in the region, multilateral institutions? Is something like IORA good enough, or is there a requirement for other types of organizations in the region to help, whether it is in terms of development agenda or whether it is in terms of security cooperation?
It's based geographically, okay, so here you have this kind of organization, which basically geographically, you have GCC, you have IRM, you have different. But here might be you need another issue that this organization, okay, cooperation between these organizations on collective efforts rather than each one of them individually is doing itself. And you find kind of climate change, piracy, whatever it is, threats the security and, of course, the development and stability in the region.
Any of you, would you want to answer? I mean,
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, your question is, do we need new institutions to deal with these common challenges? My view is that if we define whether it's climate change or security, maritime security, and expansion of trade and infrastructure development as development questions in general, then I think we can find space for them in existing global or regional institutions without having to create a new one altogether. It might look self-evident that, or rather, in my view, it's not self-evident, but the idea that we create an institution for every definition of a development challenge might be also part of what does. Because you create a new institution, then it takes some time for it to develop its global profile, and then to be able to engage in the kind of diplomacy that is required. I think bureaucrats like it, let's be honest, because it gives them opportunities everywhere to be represented and to do that. But perhaps the most cost-effective way is to say, look, we have global institutions, or we have institutions that are at the region, and all the countries on the Western Indian Ocean seaboard could find an opportunity to actually pin or tag the question of maritime policy development in an existing institution. It requires some such, but that's the reason there are researchers here, and I'm sure there'd be one of them who can look at charters and find a place in which you can pin it, as opposed to building the case for a new institution altogether from the ground.
I think we can open it up for questions. We have about 45 minutes or so. If anybody would like to start, please raise your hand and I can call upon you. Oh yes, Nilant, I think. Yeah. And then we'll turn to you next. And if you could please introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Sure. Nilanthi Samaranayaka from CNA. My question is for Navdeep Suri. You mentioned the increasing attention that India is directing toward the Western Indian Ocean and the Gulf. I want to know, what has been the evolution of this increasing interest and policy attention? Was there a particular event that took place in that region, or I'm curious about the catalysts to greater attention, just because there's been such a large population already in that region of Indians and persistent energy interests for India. So I was just curious about the timing. Thank you.
I mean, at the risk of oversimplifying, I would say one is that you've seen that steady evolution in Indian foreign policy of a greater engagement in key geographies in our neighborhood, in our extended neighborhood. And so this is really a part of that we spent many years looking only at our land borders as our security interests. And there's been a recognition over the last decade or so that we need to pay much greater attention to our maritime borders as well, and to actively pursue cooperation with a number of countries which have similar interests, and with whom we have traditionally had ties, but that was not defined in the terms that we are doing now. So take a country like Seychelles, for example, or where we didn't have too much going on, but where there is now an active cooperation that you see, particularly in the field of maritime security.
We have a question here, the young lady.
Thank you. Lucy Corkin from South Africa. I've been listening to the comments and I've been fascinated that other than sort of an oblique reference by Navdeep, we haven't really talked about China's Belt and Roads Initiative at all. And I would like to hear a response from the panelists as to how they see this, how they see China's quite aggressive moves throughout the sea lanes, particularly in the spaces that we're talking about, what the response is of the panelists, whether this is seen as something that can be brought into multilateral fora, whether this is a direct response to that, and where you see this going, and where you see the future of this kind of engagement going.
Well, I think, Kwame, you addressed a little bit of that, at least, but would you like to?
Well, I think
Kenya's often
yes.
identified as a key part of Belt and Road, at least the maritime road.
Okay, I cannot read the minds of India's leaders to actually understand why there's sudden impetus for this. But what I can tell you about Africa or Kenya are two things. First, I think the expansion of global trade is something that Africa as a whole seeks. And we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which comes into force this year in July. So expanding inter-Africa trade, but also trade between Africa and other parts of the country is a defined development objective. That notwithstanding, I have to mention, because Kenya, among many other African countries, both on the east and on the west, actually throughout the continent, are identified a part of the PAL in the China's One Belt, One Road initiative. So I think, in a way, we'd have to ask ourselves how do we situate this new interest to actually develop regional cooperation around the Western Indian Ocean against the One Belt, One Road initiative. My thinking is, and I don't take this just so that I can walk the middle ground, but my thinking is that they're not necessarily inconsistent with each other. It's long overdue for the African continent and for countries in the East, and specifically Kenya, to develop their own, or rather, to develop and actually expand maritime policy for themselves. More focused, more coherent maritime policy. I mentioned this because I'm conscious as well that, and I think some of you know, that Kenya and Somalia are actually right now at the International Court of Justice, of course, under arbitration for some part in terms of the demarcation of the exclusive economic zones for each of them. Each of us has a different interpretation about how that should be done. So these are countries that are neighbors. I think Kenya has a role right now in trying to stabilize part of southern Somalia, so that even complicates it. But the truth is, talking about how we regard the ocean as a global commons and what parts of it is exclusive economic zones is something that the African continent is going to have to do by necessity, specifically. Yeah.
Minister Syed, how does your government view China's Belt and Road Initiative? How does your government view China's Belt and Road Initiative?
That's, I think it's a very important initiative. We are welcoming, we started also free trade zone and different economic platform to attract FDI, whether we welcome Chinese companies to come and operate, in Qatar and these free trade zone, and as well as other international companies. We are actually, our team on the ground to encourage Indian companies, and we have European, we have American. So anything will enhance the trade and business between, our region and different regions. That's historically been there. And, anything will facilitate and will enhance the current situation to take the trade between, Qatar and the Gulf in general, and Asia or India or Africa, I think that's, we encourage it, and that's a good for the region and for, the trade, in general, worldwide. So any initiatives like this, we encourage it and we welcome, which that will facilitate trade and business between nations.
If I could just
jump in.
add, and I think this is something that we were discussing with Kwame as well before we came to the podium. I think there's a reality of the Chinese investments, many of them creating useful infrastructure, but there's also the reality that we were talking about resentment on the ground, because there's very little African input into those projects. Those projects are executed almost entirely by Chinese workers, and there's no transfer of knowledge or technology or any of those other aspects. And I think as a former Indian diplomat, what I can say is that something that we do better on a smaller scale is build capacity. In country after country, you would see that there is that kind of an appreciation that, okay, India doesn't do projects on the scale that the Chinese do, but when they do, they are, you'll have half a dozen Indians and the rest would be really entirely locally managed and run.
Could you give an example or two of some Indian projects like that?
Well, years back, China was building a big pipeline in Sudan, now South Sudan, and Indians, ONGC, were also doing it. The Chinese project was entirely done with Chinese workers, and in the Indian case, there were 5 workers, and that's it. And their plan was also to train and leave. Look at the model that we use for our centers for excellence in IT, which we now have successfully running in a number of countries. The model actively has in its architecture that we will only be there for 2 years or 3 years at the most. And after that, the intent is to create enough training capacity as part of the module so that whichever, whether it's Ethiopia or Ghana or wherever, they can take over and run with it. So it's a different model.
I see
Okay.
I see a number of questions, so we will take maybe 3 or 4 questions. So with the mic, yes, please.
My name is Dr. Sharma. Since you mentioned about Gulf of Hormuz, what kind of security measures are taken to protect the passage from Gulf of Hormuz? Because it involves about $800 to $1 trillion trade. And if some mishap happens in this particular area, the entire trade could be disrupted.
Behind you, yes, please. But so,
Okay.
yes.
Then yes. Okay. Peter Rimmele, Konrad Adenauer Foundation. If you look at the growth in this region of the western part of Indian Ocean, we have also to look at the growth drivers, business sector. And Mr. Suri mentioned before that out of an Indian perspective, there is a large diaspora, Indian ethnic diaspora in the Gulf and also in East African countries. My question would be to Mr. Suri, looking at it, that especially Kenya has a large Indian community and they're mainly involved in the business sector. So how far has one looked into use this, what I really think is an asset, to increase the relations across the ocean between this Kenyan, Indian ethnic business community to India? And I could extend it also to Mr. Suri, how far is India looking at that asset on the other side if one wants to connect them?
Same table, I think. No, sorry, in front of you, I'm sorry, yes.
Thank you. Thank you, I'm Pradeep Mehta. Mr. Suri spoke about building capacity. And in fact, we have a live example of building capacity in your panel, Kwame Obino, the Institute for Economic Affairs, with whom we've built a capacity to work on competition since about the year 1999, Kwame?
2001, yes.
2001. This is a live example. A question to Kwame. In terms of the huge Chinese investment in the ports that we were talking about in Tanzania and Kenya, you've not spoken about the issue of the public debt that the countries are going to incur, which is a serious problem which many countries are facing with these huge Chinese investments coming. And if they are not functioning, or if they are not being exploited, or not exploitable, as you had said, and the capacity is so much, how do you visualize the future? And how are you going to, deal with it? I know, Kenya and Tanzania are outlets to, a lot of Middle African countries for their exports and imports both, yet. Thank you.
And maybe take one question, the lady in the front, please.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, my name is Françoise Nicolas, from the French Institute of International Relations in Paris. As you may all know, my country, France, has started recently to develop an Indo-Pacific strategy, which, unlike a number of other Indo-Pacific strategies, first thing includes, the whole of the Indian Ocean, so goes all the way to the eastern coast of Africa, first thing. And second thing is very much inclusive, meaning that it is not exclusively militarized. It also includes other issues like precisely climate change, environmental issues, disaster relief management, etc., etc. So I was just wondering what you think of this strategy. What do you think of France's contribution to this part of the world and to the security in this region? Thank you.
Will you direct that to anyone?
Well,
or
no,
the entire
nobody
panel?
in particular. Perhaps Mr. What's his name? We know. Perhaps.
Okay.
All panelists.
Sure,
Thank you.
sure. So maybe we start with Dr. Ketpi on the Gulf of Hormuz question. What is being done on the security of the Gulf of Hormuz given the recent escalation there?
The problem that, with this, as I said, they've been called for that, but it didn't work because the different perspective between GCC and Iran, different views, as I said. The situation of zero-sum game, which is between them. Now, there is that initiative that Zarif mentioned, which he talked about it, the non-aggression pact. It is, if you look at it, who took the aggressive action? The Gulfists, they didn't. All it came from Iranian side, the aggression. But if we implement it, if there is a sincere initiative from the Iranian, it will work, okay? And here also, if there is no stable Yemen, no stable Iraq, it will not work any kind of that Gulf structure. The other things also, when I mentioned the global powers, their competition over the region also escalating here and there. The conflict between each other, the Chinese, the Russian, the American, if they didn't reach an agreement and if they are not sincere to stabilize this region, also we cannot reach anything. Even if those between GCC and Iraq and the Gulf and Yemen reach some formula without any endorsement from those global powers, it will not work. And if there is also that kind of mass weapon of mass destruction in the region, also it will exacerbate the situation.
In the last several months, just to follow up, India has deployed naval vessels in the Gulf of Hormuz to keep open the sea lines of communication. Would you see this as a welcome step, that a country like India is assuming a role in the security of the Strait of Hormuz, or do you see this as aggravating security competition?
No, it should be. I'm always saying now, India by 2025 will be the largest country importing oil from the Gulf, and I'm sorry to say that, but I'm always also talking about that. Also, the Chinese used to play a free rider, that everybody is securing the Gulf. They are not taking anything. I think this is a good step. It might ease the tension when you have those countries from the region participating in securing. India has a good relation with Iran, also with the Gulf region, it can play a good role in that.
On Peter Ramilli's question, I was going to turn to you, or did you want to address this issue?
Sure. Also, but the point that was that came from there, and you answered it in part. It's not something that we advertise aggressively, but since the escalation of tensions in May in the Gulf following the attacks on shipping in Fujairah, and particularly since the attacks on the refinery, Aramco refinery in August, we have had 2 ships constantly in the Gulf, and their sole purpose is to escort or keep a watchful eye on Indian merchant shipping. They usually come to Dubai for restocking and refueling and so on. And it's been very much appreciated in the region that Indians are not free riders. They are willing to contribute to this security or stability in the region by at least bringing assets in that matter. There is a degree of sort of conversation that we have with the British and others who have assets in the region, and it's a presence that's been widely welcomed. So that's what. On your points, having served in several countries which have a significant Indian diaspora, and certainly Tanzania, where I worked, and Kenya, which I know a little bit about, South Africa, and the Gulf. I'd say each case is different. In South Africa, the Indian community very clearly defines itself as South African first, and that's because they've been there 140 years and have gone through the whole situation of apartheid and learned that how they define themselves. In the Gulf, it is predominantly a first-generation non-resident Indian community. The majority of them have Indian passports. In Kenya and Tanzania, it's kind of mixed in between. In the Gulf, the Indian community really is a bridge between the countries in economic terms. Some of the biggest trade comes through Indian companies. They also send close to $40 billion in remittances and so on. In East Africa, many of the businesses, as you said, are run by members of the Indian business community. They have been uniquely responsible for tie-ups, say in the pharmaceutical sector. If today every major Indian pharmaceutical company has a presence in Kenya or Tanzania, it is because the Indian business community brought them in, and the same could be extrapolated to other sectors. I don't think the government plays a very active role in this process. This is the organic process, and I'm quite happy that it stays that way rather than have the heavy hand of government trying to guide the businesses to do a particular thing. These are communities that are well integrated into the mainstream community, unlike the other country that we are talking about. And I quite prefer that we keep the light touch and let the contribution be organic rather than state-driven.
Kwame, on the question on public debt that was asked, how much is that an issue?
Let me start with the easier question, which is the last one about France's Indo-Pacific strategy. I think any country has should have the freedom to develop its strategy as it sees fit. Many countries now try to draw strategies in a way that is actually very expansive. That too is not necessarily a problem. I think what matters though is whether those who might be affected or those who might see it as a new form of expansion have an opportunity to comment on it. So because I haven't seen it, maybe what I should do is when I go back home, I and my colleagues should find it and actually see what it means. And perhaps we can speak with somebody from the French embassy to come and actually talk about it. Because I think this is what sometimes people who come from the African continent, which I come from, is that people develop policies regarding African countries, mentioning benefits and some kind of shared responsibilities, and nobody is aware about what it is. So maybe that kind of discourse is something, and I hope the French understand that well enough. I've seen French diplomats speaking here about mutual respect for countries, and at the same time that dialogue is indispensable in international public affairs. So I'll look at that and see what it means. But on the whole, I don't think anybody on the African continent thinks we own the Indian Ocean, and therefore that France should not develop a policy of one kind or the other. It's just what kind of participation, and let's look at it and talk about it in terms of principles and what its consequences would be. That's one. Two, it is also understood that, I mean, French presence, together, as I mentioned, Chinese, French presence actually helped in terms of stabilizing the Indian Ocean when we had all those disturbances across from Somalia. So maybe these policies informed by that. And in itself demonstrated African countries have very small navies, as I mentioned. And sometimes that is not necessarily their priority, because I actually think the reason some of these policies came about is because at the beginning of that time, the first response was actually by ship owners and insurance companies actually hiring security to provide that security out there, which made many people very, very uncomfortable. So if you're having state-to-state cooperation, I think that is preferable, in my view, and maybe this is not necessarily a bad thing. Let me go now to Mr. Pradeep Mehta. He's right. When I joined the Institute of Economic Affairs, my first job was on industrial organization and analyzing competition policy, and the Institute of Economic Affairs, together with CATS, had a project on the continent, analyzing competition policy and its influence. So yes, he's right in saying that there's been cooperation and obviously the development of capacity at the private level between institutions in India and Kenya. But to your point about, look, many African countries, including the one in which I live, have are in public debt distress. But what I mean is that just 6 years ago, Kenya's debt to GDP ratios was at 40. Today, it's close to 60. Our calculation at the Institute of Economic Affairs, if you take all factors considered, it's probably close to 65. The problem is not the debt to GDP ratio. The problem is the tenure of the debt, in the sense that some of this debt is high interest rates because it's non-concessional, and it's going to be paid at a much closer, in much closer and tighter cycles, which means there's been serious pressure. There is already serious pressure in the public finances in Kenya. However, Kenya, as I mentioned, just like many African countries, for a long time had a problem attracting investments in infrastructure development. And many corporations and many institutions from largely Europe and the US did not want to touch African countries. And so China saw that opportunity and came in. You cannot blame them for that. So that's the first point. The second point is, I believe that sovereign nations get to determine who they deal with on the one side, and secondly, on what terms the debt will be. Now, Chinese debt has come, most of it tends to be in the form of the Export-Import Bank. So Kenya has constructed a new railway line. The first one was constructed in the year 1896 by the British government with huge contribution from Indian workers, yes, and therefore Kenya too has had almost 4 generations of of Kenyans actually, whose parents and grandparents were actually from India. So it's a feature of our domestic life in Kenya to have many races and many people from different parts of the world. So coming to the debt problem, the government of Kenya borrowed non-concessional debt, very, very huge cycles, and very quickly, and at the same time invested some of that money in the huge railway line. Now this railway line, when it was being constructed, was equivalent, the investment was equivalent to 5% of Kenya's GDP. It was Chinese funded. The Chinese Export-Import Bank, only a small part of it was concessional. The rest of it was through commercial loans with those banks, and the grace period was 6 years, which ended this last year. So from this year, there's going to be payments, and the entire payment period is really short. So obviously that means it's all done. If you look at the economics of it, again, this is not the Chinese to blame, it's the government of Kenya. They made a completely bad decision, paid so much more. I think it's been suggested that because of corruption, it's true, and that's a Kenyan problem, not a Chinese problem, even if Chinese companies participated. I think what I'm trying to avoid is the African countries taking the opportunity to bash China for making the wrong policy choices. Wrong economic policy is usually contingent on wrong political choices. And for that, we must take responsibilities without necessarily trying to export that problem. So that's true. My final question was about the participation of Kenyans of Indian origin. We call them that. I hope that's not rude. But they are Kenyans from different parts of Asia who came into this country, and many of them have actually been in the professional services, but mostly they're in the manufacturing sector and as traders. A small number of them, however, have gone including into the public service, and some of them work up there. So yes, we have many of them who are glad to be Kenyans, and a new constitution in Kenya allows them to hold dual citizenship. So some of them hold Indian passports as well as Kenyan passports, and in many ways, people consider them. Now, there are tensions here and there sometimes, as every complex society that needs to deal with it, but it's not something that necessarily targets them. Finally, I will mention that Kenyans hold India fondly, because when I was coming here, there's a Kenya Airways flight that comes every morning through Mumbai, and I will tell you that something like 20 to 30%, my guesstimate, 20 to 30% of the people in there are coming to India for what we call medical tourism or treatment. Cancer treatment and some kind of very highly specialized treatment in Kenya is very expensive, so our National Health Service prefers to send patients who qualify for treatment, which is very, very effective, and a third to 1/4 of what it costs to do that in China. What it costs to do that in Kenya. So that also is part of that cooperation. So there's cooperation at many levels, even that are not necessarily driven by government to government, but people making their own decisions and learning globally what's the best area, what kind of services are available here. So trade in services between India and Kenya is actually much, much higher, and perhaps presages that there'll be better days ahead. Thanks.
I just want to direct a quick question to the other two panelists very quickly before turning back to the audience. But General, France a few years ago released a map of its, the French Defense Ministry actually released a map of its Indo-Pacific strategy, and you could see that France considers itself a resident power in the Indian Ocean with the territories in Réunion, in New Caledonia, in the Pacific, in Mayotte, and other places. Madagascar, of course, has a lot of defense cooperation with France. How do you view the evolution of France's Indo-Pacific strategy?
I don't think there is any problem because, there is an evolution on the strategic situation in all parts of the world. Each country should find what their best interests are with cooperating with another country. I think Madagascar has a traditional tie with France and will continue with that, especially in my country. We are a French-speaking country surrounded by non-French-speaking countries. So we are landlocked in language. Our neighbors speak English, Portuguese, and this will continue, I think, in the future, in the next 10 years at least. What we should do is to look at the evolution of the world at large, not at only bilateral cooperation with one country or another one. We look at what the Chinese are doing. Turkey also is very dynamic in Africa. We have the Russian in mining. So everybody is around, so we need to be very careful on which country should have cooperation with which domain. So for me, it's not really a concern for now. You have to diversify. Yeah.
Minister, if I may direct the question I asked Dr. Ketpe as well. President Trump has spoken about countries being free riders in the Gulf, and your country is home to a major U.S. base, amongst other things. Do you see it as a good sign that countries like India are playing a more active security role, and would you like to see more, or how do you fall Particularly given your exports, energy exports.
I'm not a specialist in the diplomacy and policy, but I'm more in the economic affairs. From economic affairs, it's all about economic development. It's what the people need. It's economic development that will create more job, more opportunities, more of freedom, for entrepreneurs to prove themselves and to grow their economy and, have a better life, better education, better health care. And that's what all people need in all over the world. So that couldn't happen without security and stability. And in this world, you are not alone. It should be regional and the global stability. But, let's go to regional. And regional stability, that could not happen without, a frank dialogue or, without talking to each other about creating a clear vision. And then how you approach the whole world about how do you see the regional plan? What is your plan here as a region? And then you communicate it to the world and you start, try to have the impact, and prove it from other nations or other big trade partners or political partners as well. So it's all about planning. It's all about, putting the vision together, communicate, and you cannot exclude anyone. The region is the region. Whoever is there, you have to talk to each other and to develop your message to the world that you are seeking stability, prosperity, and that will be very important to everyone. We are providing, the 30% of the world, maybe, energy resources, and this region is very critical for stability, not only to the people of the region, but to everyone else. And that's why, at the end, whether or not how you plan it tactically, but at the end, you need to reach out to this goal, stability, which will create development. That's what I can say.
We'll take another round of questions. I think we have time for one or two more. So let's start with the gentleman in the front. If we could get a microphone, just 1 second.
Thank you. This is to Ma'am Abdeslam Al-Kapdi.
I'm sorry, if you could introduce yourself as well.
This is K. Siddharth. I'm an earth scientist. We have been ardent admirers of you, ma'am, for whatever that you have done in the Middle East region. I understand Middle East and whole of Southwest Asia having branded itself on the basis of the work that they have done. Whether Dubai goes on to become an aviation hub, whether Abu Dhabi goes on to think of becoming an aviation hub, and even Sharjah, Azman, all of those regions go on to be forged a different type of an identity as well. Now, we do go on to think that the major resource with the Middle East countries in the future will go on to be their branding, the way that they're going to brand themselves, not only in terms of being an aviation hub. Is it not that one can go on to think of, in the whole of this region, Southwest Asian and Middle Eastern region, there is a project that is going to be conceived by the government, which the Dubai government has been doing, building a complete artificial city in that place, which will go on to showcase the entire of the piece of planet Earth, like you have done it in certain places, which will be in a position to brand itself, because it has a lot of land, and on such type of a land, one can always go on to bring about certain projects, like a building of the miniature Earth, like building of biosphere reserves, by building of an aquarium, all of these at one place.
So could you focus on a question,
So
please?
the question is, why can't the Middle Eastern countries go on to think of branding itself more even in this manner?
There's a hand right in the back. Excuse me? If you could get a mic to...
Thank you. Hi, I'm Natalie Samby from Verve Research in Australia, and we've talked a little bit about implementing of security institutions in the region. I'd like to ask the panel, if institutions need leadership, what does leadership look like to each of you? And if states are to lead in the region, which states would be preferable and which are not?
Take one or two more questions if we have them. Any other hands? Okay, we'll turn to the, so in some ways a variation of, I'm sorry? No, we'll just do, these in, so,
that will be to Navdeep Suri, sir.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So, we'll take another round of questions later. Where do you think leadership should come from? We'll start with Ambassador Surya.
You know, it's a bit dangerous to try and paraphrase the External Affairs Minister because he spoke on this at some length yesterday about the India way and how we perceive ourselves. And I think the 2 or 3 points that struck me as particularly relevant were one, that we see ourselves as contributors to stability and security in a fairly volatile situation. Second, that we see ourselves as continue to support some of those values that we had traditionally cherished and endorsed, which is that we are standard bearers for and with the South, and not just a self-centered country as we grow. And third, that we recognize, respect the global commons and do what we can to contribute to that. To me, that would be the vision of leadership. But as I said, with the caveat that these are mostly not my original thoughts, but something that were articulated yesterday.
If I ask the other two, and I'll circle back to the question on the first question on the Middle East, but Kwame, you have some skepticism about more institutions, more regional institutions. Where then should leadership come from in the region?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know that it's useful to ask where leadership will come from instead of, what I'm comfortable with is to ask ourselves, what would successful policy look like? And successful policy would probably come from a belief in multilateral solutions. I think multilateral institutions globally, starting with the WTO, are in trouble. I think it's a phase. They're probably the best institutions for global, for designing policies that would be successful globally. So that's one. Two is I think people who are prepared to lead should be people who are prepared to pay some cost and actually have some skin in the game. Often what we see, and especially people from Africa, get very, very concerned about multilateral or regional or global institutions, because often it looks like everybody wants to behave as if we talk about, say, for instance, climate problems right now, it's our common problem, but some people are more responsible for creating and driving it than others. So we start with the view that, look, it's our common problem. We concede that it's going to be more difficult for some people to bear the cost than others, but at the same time, that's one. And the third one is, especially because we've been talking about the security problem, rather security as a big issue in the west of the Indian Ocean. I think we have to start with the fact that force will not be the first option, the second option, and the third option. I think we need to give an opportunity for the fact that, look, we will try as much as is possible to exploit and take as much as is possible opportunities for resolving issues in an inclusive way and peacefully before any other thing comes. And that's why I say that anybody's Indo-Pacific policy that involves ignoring other voices, or many others, will actually not receive much cooperation. And without cooperation, most of these policies tend not to be very successful.
General, who should lead?
First of all, I don't believe in having a big organization or dealing with security. Maybe the best thing is to try to coordinate because of the diversity, the number of states, the coastal states in the Indian Ocean, the diversity of the challenges they face, the difference in the strength of the country in terms of finance or equipment. It's very difficult. Even if we do it in turning chairmanship, I think it would be very difficult. Let's just look at an organization such as United Nations. African Union too heavy. And for a small country like ours, just to pay for the membership fee is already a problem because we are a member of different organizations which in turn do not give benefit to us. So we have to make a choice and think it's better to set up policy, as he said, and from there, we're talking now about multilateralism, depending on which theme interests one country or the other, and then take some meetings about it, and then coordinate. Otherwise, it will just be there, and another organization that does nothing, except giving frustration to the members.
If we turn to two colleagues from the Gulf, Dr. Ketbi, in answer to the first question, are there plans for, I mean, you founded a think tank in Abu Dhabi, are there plans on projecting the UAE as an innovation hub, as a model, and for, the region as a whole? Is that on the cards?
I just want to give also my view about who should lead. In our annual conference last November, we tried to map the power in the world in terms of their capabilities. How much we have in terms of artificial intelligence capability, cyber capability, economic capabilities, and of course here military. It's there, and this is we map it and measure it between the great powers. Okay, so here it's not about who will lead based on what. What do you have to lead? The other thing also, if you lack a vision, if you lack a strategic thinking, also, maybe you will be a leader now, but on the long run, you cannot. And I think the United States, when it measured its technological capabilities with China, and found itself slack and it's coming behind, that's why the reaction came in pivoting toward Asia, their strategy. Well, back to the question. I think UAE created a model for development for the region. And each GCC, it has its own model, but UAE in terms, because when you are also tiny, non-bureaucratic, you can move fast. When you have vision also, you can move fast. I wish that model in every Arab countries and non-Arab countries in the region, and instead of wasting our money on wars and competition in wars which does not yield anything, because as the minister said, at the end of the day, people, they want jobs, they want good livings, okay? And they are not involved in anything of that wars like what we saw in the region. Look to all these demonstrations evolving from Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Algeria, everywhere, and it started everywhere. People were mainly asking for social justice, for good living. And that anger, what Kadhim Sajjad talked about yesterday, that because people felt that all of that, the fruit of the development has been catched by the politician and they did not get anything. This is the case in Iraq, this is the case in Lebanon, this is the case in Iran itself. I mean, look to Iran when I'm comparing it with GCC, okay? They are huge capabilities in terms of advanced military, okay, even in artificial intelligence. But look to the development in the country. Look to the infrastructure and this artificial intelligence has not been applied on the good governance inside the country. That's what makes people angry, and they are protesting and they are demonstrating. So if what brings stability in the region and other regions, that de-escalate the competition on the upper level between politicians and look to the people, all the people and all over the world. They want to live in peace. Nobody has interest in wars. And without coming to that, as I said, and always repeating, to a win-win situation, everybody will not take everything. Everybody will take at least something and leave another share, other share for others.
Finally, last word, Minister, to riff off that question. Qatar, you're hosting a World Cup soon. You've developed as an airline hub. You have Al Jazeera. What are you doing in some ways to develop as an innovation hub and as well?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, it's not about the World Cup is one event, which is major event. It's been decided that we'd like to be, a main hub for a sport, and that's the World Cup and other sport event has been happening. And we believe sport will bridge the gap between nations and will encourage cooperation and multicultural exchange and communication. And that's for the whole region. It's not for only Qatar here. But in terms of other activities, of course, we are an education hub. We have, more than 15 international university, including also the local on the ground. So that's international hub in terms of education and science. We have Science and Technology Park. We created the Free Zone, which is Business and Innovation Park also. We have Sherb Downtown also for art, and we created the Media City. So it's a lot of activities on the ground. But as you rightly mentioned by the panelists here, it's all about your vision and where you would like to be and what you offer to the world. You build your capability and you put your offer, and competition is always good, and that's, will have a positive impact in terms of innovation and creativity here. So we are open country, and we welcome everyone to come to enjoy a super modern infrastructure that we have created in the last decade. Thank you.
Okay, on that note, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel for what's been a very wide-ranging discussion.